StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories, where biblical stories of the ages come alive.
Continuing with our series called The Early Church, we turn to the book of Acts, chapter 22, verse 30, going through to chapter 24, verse 27, for another true Bible story titled 2 Years in Prison.
StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories with your host, Dr. Joe Jackson. Stories directly from God's holy word, told in easy-to-understand story form that the whole family will enjoy, and featuring the work of a talented artist illustrating each week's story. Now gather the family because it's time for this week's Bible Story.
After Paul had been rescued from the Jewish mob, he was taken from the temple into the castle for safekeeping. The chief captain wanted to know why the Jews were so bitter in their hate against Paul, so he commanded the chief priests and rulers to meet together, and he brought Paul down from the castle and set him before them. Paul looked earnestly upon the council, and he said to them, "Brethren, I have lived trying to do the will of God all of my life until this day." Sitting in the council was the high priest Ananias, dressed in white garments which were worn by all the priests. He was so enraged at these words of Paul that he said to those who were standing near Paul, "Strike him on the mouth." And Paul, roused to sudden anger at such unjust words, said in answer, "God shall strike you, O whited wall. Do you sit to judge me by the law, and yet against the law command me to be struck?" Those that were standing by said to Paul, "Do you dare speak such words against the high priest of God?" "I didn't know that he was high priest," answered Paul. "It's written in the law not to speak evil of a ruler of your people." Paul saw that there were two parties in the council, and by a few wise words, he made some of the rulers friendly to him, so that they stood up and said, "We find no evil in this man. Perhaps a spirit has spoken to him, or maybe an angel." And this made the rulers on the other side all the more furious, and such a quarrel arose between them that the chief captain was afraid that Paul would be torn in pieces, so he again sent down the soldiers to take him by force from the council and bring him back into the castle. On the night after this, while Paul was in his cell there in the castle, the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have spoken for me at Jerusalem, so shall you speak for me at Rome." Early on the next morning, more than 40 of the Jews laid a plan to kill Paul, and they bound themselves together by an oath, swearing that they would neither eat nor drink until they had slain him. These men came to the chief priests, and they said, "We've bound ourselves under a great oath that we'll taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now, ask the chief captain to bring Paul down again to meet the council so that they may hear him and try his case once more. And while he's on his way to the council, we'll rush in and kill him." Now, Paul had a sister living there in Jerusalem, and her son heard of this plot and came to the castle and told Paul about it. And then Paul called one of the officers and said to him, "Take this young man to the chief captain, for he has something to tell him." So the officer brought the young man to the chief captain and said to him, "Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you, for he has something to say to you." And then the chief captain took the young man aside and asked him, "What is it that you want to say to me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the council again, but do not let him go, for there are more than 40 men watching for him, and they've sworn an oath together that they'll neither eat nor drink until they've killed Paul. The chief captain listened carefully, and then he sent the young man away and said to him, "Don't tell anyone that you've spoken these things to me." And after the young man had gone, the chief captain called to him 2 centurions, captains over 100 men each, and he said to them, "Make ready 200 soldiers to go as far as Caesarea, and 70 men on horseback, and 200 men with spears, all to leave at 9 o'clock at night." And he told them also to have ready horses for Paul, so that he might send him safe to Felix, who was the governor of the land and who was at Caesarea. And he wrote a letter to Felix in this manner: "Claudius Lysias sends greetings to the most noble governor Felix. This man was seized by the Jews and would have been killed by them, but I came upon him with the soldiers and took him from their hands, having learned that he was a citizen of Rome. And to find out the reasons why they were so strongly against him, I brought him down to their council, but I found that the charges against him were about questions of their law, but nothing deserving death or prison. When I heard that there was a plot to kill him, I sent him at once to you, and I told his enemies to go before you with their charges." So in the night, almost 500 men were sent with a guard for Paul. He was brought out of the castle and taken that night as far as to Antipatris, I guess. Let me back up a little. He was brought out of the castle and...
Let's go back to so in the night.
Okay. So in the night, almost 500 men were sent with a guard for Paul. He was brought out of the castle and taken that night as far as to Antipatris, about 40 miles. Next day, the soldiers left him, thinking him to be no longer in danger, and they returned to Jerusalem, while the horsemen rode on with him to Caesarea, where the governor Felix lived. The officer in charge gave the letter to the governor, and the governor read the letter, and then asked Paul from what land he had come. And Paul told him that he belonged to the land of Cilicia in Asia Minor. And Felix said, "I'll hear your case when those who bring charges against you have come down." And he sent Paul to be kept in a castle which had once belonged to Herod. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias and some others came with him down to Caesarea, bringing along with them a lawyer named Tertullus. And when Paul was brought before them in the presence of Felix the governor, Tertullus made a speech in which he charged Paul with riot and lawbreaking and many other evil deeds. They also said that he was a ringleader in the party of the Nazarenes being the name that they had given to the Lord's church. And the Jews all joined in the charge, saying that all these things were true. After they had spoken, the governor motioned with his hand toward Paul, showing that he, Paul, might now speak. And he began and said these words: "I know that you have been for many years a judge over this people, and for that reason I speak to you willingly. For you may know that it's only 12 days now since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. Nor was I quarreling with anyone in the temple, nor stirring up a crowd in the temple or the synagogues or anywhere in the city. Nor can they prove to you the things that they've said against me. But I do own to this, that after the way which they call the party of the Nazarenes, so do I serve the God of our fathers, believing all things in the law and in the prophets, and having a hope that in God the dead shall be raised up. and I have always tried to keep my heart free from wrong toward God and toward men. Now, after many years, I came to bring gifts to my people and offerings for the altar. And with these they found me in the temple, but not with a crowd, nor with a riot. But there were certain Jews from Asia Minor who ought to have been here if they have anything against me. Felix knew something about the Lord's church, and he said, "When Lysias, the chief captain, comes down, I'll settle this case." And he ordered Paul to be kept under guard, but that his friends might freely come to see him. After a few days, Felix and his wife Drusilla, who was a Jewess, sent for Paul and heard from him with regard to the gospel of Christ. And as Paul preached to him of right living and of ruling oneself and of the judgment of God that should come upon sinners, Felix became alarmed, and he said, "Go away for this time, and when a fit time comes and I'm ready to listen, I'll send for you." Felix was not a just judge, for he really hoped that Paul might give him some money so that he might set Paul free. And with this in his mind, he sent for Paul and talked with him many times. 2 whole years passed, and Paul was still in prison at Caesarea. At the end of that time, Felix was called back to Rome, and a man named Porcius Festus was sent as governor in his place. Felix wished to please the Jews, and he left Paul a prisoner.
Precious memories